Welcome to tonight's meeting. I'm Melanie Rummel. I am a member of the League of Women Voters of Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, and I will be facilitating the program this evening. Just so we all know we're in the right place, it's our Water in Peril. And I have to give a special shout out to Madame McMurrin, who was my French teacher in high school. Bonjour, Madame. For those of you who may not know, the League of Women Voters is a national organization with over 800 local and state chapters. We encourage both men and women to join us. If you are not a member, there is information outside on the table. The League is a nonpartisan political organization which works to increase understanding of major public policy issues and influences public policy through education and advocacy. In the last month, you may have seen one or more of our recent candidate forums. We are here to learn today about a very important issue, water. The League of Women Voters has been supporting effective regulatory programs pertaining to water since the 1960s. At the national, state, and local level, the League has continued to push for environmental protection, safe drinking water, and safeguards against non-point pollution. In 1993, the United Nations General Assembly designated March 22nd as World Water Day. Since then, nations and organizations all over the world have observed the day by focusing attention on the importance of fresh water and of managing it in a sustainable manner. Many authorities believe that water will be the source of conflicts in the future, just as oil has been. Two other community organizations have joined us in observing World Water Day by co-sponsoring this evening's program. They are the AAUW and Lake Forest Open Lands. In the interest of full disclosure, I am the chairman of the board of Lake Forest Open Lands, so I'm particularly interested in this evening's program. This evening, we are going to hear from three local experts who are going to discuss our own local water problems. Also, on the back of this evening's handout is a list of helpful water tips. One thing before we move on, I would like to tell you about two programs coming up in April. The League is hosting a discussion about the privatization of government services. That program is on Thursday, April 19th at 7 p.m. The program, called Is Privatization the Answer, will center on some past examples and suggestions for how the process should be handled in the future. Please watch news media and e-alerts for more information. Also, our sister league, the League of Women Voters of Lake County, is sponsoring a panel dialogue on Sunday, April 15th at 2 p.m. at Lake Forest College. Three well-known names in the criminal justice scene are participating in the program called False Confessions, Do They Happen? The speakers are Jed Stone, who is a criminal defense attorney, Rob Warden, Executive Director of the Center of Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University Law School, and Juan Rivera, a name many of you may recognize, who served 19 years in prison after being wrongly convicted. Our website is www.lwv-lflb.org, and we'll have more information on the website shortly. And now, pertaining to this evening's three speakers, there are short biographies inside this handout. We have Judy Beck, who is the Lake Michigan manager at the U.S. EPA Region 5. Welcome. Mike Adam, who's senior biologist at the Lake County Health Department. Welcome. And John Sentel, the president of Lake Forest Open Lands, and prior to being president of Open Lands, he was president of the Wetlands Initiative, a regional land conservation organization. They are experts in their fields and will share with us their perspective about water issues in our area. And after their presentations, we will take questions from the audience. Judy, would you please start? Do you want all three members up here at the same time, Mary? Or? Okay.
there are 4 states that share the resource that we call Lake Michigan, the second largest of the Great Lakes by volume. And so this is a broad overview, and then you'll hear a little bit more about some of the specifics from the other speakers. The Sleeping Bear Dunes was recently voted the most beautiful place in America on the TV show Good Morning America. So I'd like to start out with that picture. And if you've never seen those dunes that soar 400 feet above Lake Michigan, I don't get paid by the Michigan Tourist Bureau, but it really is worth a trip. One of the things that people always say is, how is Lake Michigan doing? And we decided that we needed to have a common response to that, because Lake Michigan is a complex and varied ecosystem. And so we say that it's an outstanding natural resource of global significance, under stress, and in need of special attention. And you can see here just this collage of pictures from Lake Michigan. We are large enough that it's clearly seen from space. What we're doing to many of our shorelines is hardening them, which is not good for the aquatic ecosystem. We also have a number of farms in the states. We have some of the best farmland in the world, but if we don't use it in a sustainable manner, it will not only be a detriment to the farmers, to their livelihoods, but also to the lake, and often is a stress on the lake. A wonderful story I am proud to report on is that in the last 3 years, we now have eagles nesting in Milwaukee, in Chicago, and in Northwest Indiana. And that is for the first time in 100 years. They had left, or if they were still around, they could not successfully reproduce because they are fish eaters, and the fish had such high levels of PCBs that the eggs would never develop. And here we have eagles nesting and raising their young. And so if people say, are there any good news stories, that is a really major good news story. We also have, and again, here's another picture of Sleeping Bear Dunes, the ability to look out and enjoy this lake and all of its recreational attributes. Just quickly, there's 33 major watersheds, many.
You are a master of your own universe.
Okay, and
it just goes like this.
And, okay. And so we have 33 major watersheds around, and we have 10 official areas of concern. We have an agreement with Canada called the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And through that process, we determined that there were some harbors who really needed special assistance. And as you can see on here, the one in Illinois is Waukegan Harbor. And I will mention a little bit about it. And I also had a handout, because right now in Waukegan Harbor, there are millions of federal dollars going in to clean up that harbor for the second time. And last year, I think you'll remember that we had terrible storms both in the spring and in the summer. And those storms created major movement of the sand into the harbor, and it needed to be dredged. There was a very large vessel that got stuck there, and it is officially a harbor of refuge. And in fact, a few years ago, there was a tanker that did take refuge there. So millions and millions of dollars going in to clean up contaminated sediments, as well as to remove the sand due to the storms. Oh, right there, okay. I'm not sure that this is showing up very well, but what you need to know is that satellites have given us the opportunity to kind of track at a more gross level what the status of our land use is. And you can see here that we are still developing this basin. And we are not necessarily saying that you can't develop, but the question is, are you developing sustainably? So you see high-intensity development. That's often infill and better types of development. But what's troubling is that it's outpaced by low intensity, or what people would call sprawl. And as we use up the land, as we pave over, when we have the high-intensity storms that we're starting to have, that water has not the ability to soak in, and then we create our own flooding problems. There has been some growth in wetlands. We are doing a lot of wetland protection, but some types of wetlands we're doing better at restoring them than others. So this is an important thing to know. Lake Michigan, the shoreline provides resting and refueling for as many as 5 million birds, over 250 different species. They use the Great Lakes Mississippi Migratory Flyway, and it is one of the key values of the coastal ecosystem. The target is to try and preserve an additional 125,000 acres of these coastal wetlands. We are now working with the Nature Conservancy to come up with very specific targeted areas, so that if we're trying to have a dialogue with land use planners, we can talk about the most important, the most biodiversity there is, and not try to come across as trying to save everything. Coastal areas, though, are very key to the health of the ecosystem, and the fish that swim around in the lake often spawn. They come into the harbor areas, the nearshore coastal wetlands, and we need to make sure that we're protecting those areas. This is really a key for tourism. People love to come and see the migratory activity in both the spring and the fall. So if you're a fish and you need to find your way home, it's very hard to do this in the Lake Michigan Basin. And we have a fabulous fish food web. There are so many dams and so many culverts and barriers that we are putting a lot of money into trying to allow the fish to get home. When the last presidential election was heating up, some of the interest groups went to all of the candidates and they said, "What will you do for the Great Lakes?" And we extracted promises. And I say we, it wasn't the agencies, it was the interest groups and people who really cared about the lake. And when President Obama was elected, he promised that he would work with Congress, and he did. And in 2010, we got something called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which was $475 million for that year. And it has been followed up for the last 2 years with an additional $300 million. So some of the things that we have studied and talked about for over 30 years are finally in place. And fish passage, better culverts, trying to restore our native fish food web is where a lot of the money has gone. And it has been very interesting because many of these are older dams that are not very stable to begin with. So the money is going into protecting the native fish, allowing them to get upstream to spawn, but also it's often solves some safety problems that we have with some of the dams. And then this is a bird's eye view of a culvert. And apparently, after a lot of research, there are some culverts that work, where bridges go over or roads go over the streams, and there's some that don't. And so we are now trying to make sure that if we've got a culvert, it's one that, in fact, is effective and that the fish will use it. So one of the things that we are also doing is restocking, and the sturgeon of Lake Michigan is something that people wrote about when the settlers first came to this country. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but what the fish researchers have found is that if you take the fry of the sturgeon, and from the very beginning you have them in stream water so that they can bond with the smell and the taste of the chemical, that when you finally let them into the stream and they have to come back, it is much more successful. Last September, we released 100 in the Kalamazoo River. We have many of these that have been going on. So I just want to explain one thing about the sturgeon. They go out into the lake and they swim around for 10 or 15 years before they come back to raise their young. And the females often live to 80. And they are huge animals. We call them the charismatic megafauna of the Great Lakes. There's a wonderful show that's out that sometimes is in some of the museums. If you ever have a chance to see it, it's really great. So the money that we're spending now for some of these sturgeon, if you think about it, in 2091, there could be female sturgeon that are swimming around that you helped put there with your tax dollars in 2010 and 2011. So unfortunately, carp is a four-letter word. And you can see in the corner there, Oak Park is the Continental Divide here due to the fact that we reconfigured the Chicago waterway system. This is now one of the hottest issues that's being talked about and debated. There are a lot of federal dollars going into a couple of things about the carp. One is, of course, to stop them from getting into Lake Michigan, into Lake Erie, into any of the lakes. We have electric barriers in the Illinois waterway that sends a small pulse through the waterways that seems to deter them. We are tracking carefully where they are. There's some new research on eDNA that they can pick up in the water. One of the things that we're not positive about, though, is how the eDNA gets there. It doesn't not always mean that there's a live fish there. It could be that a fish had bumped up against a boat that later took the DNA forward. We have found that during spring floods, there are places where different bodies of water mingle because of a flood situation. And so we have put up some barriers both to protect Lake Erie and Lake Michigan. And I just read, and this is not strictly a Great Lakes thing, but it shows you kind of how amazing nature can be, that they now have found the carp in a river in I can't remember, I think it's South Dakota, where a large flood last year flooded out 2 levels of dams, and the carp were able to get up because of that flooding. So they're really an amazing organism. We don't want them in Lake Michigan. A couple of good news and bad news stories. The good news is we don't have zebra mussels in Lake Michigan anymore. The bad news is we have their larger cousin, the quagga mussel. Now, the quagga mussel is a little bit larger. It filters the water even faster, and it can attach to both the sandy bottom as well as rocks, which the zebra mussel needed to use. A lot of times people come up to me and they say, oh, the lake looks so good, the water's so nice and clean. And then I have to share the bad news with them that is actually not a good sign. What is happening is that the mussels are filter feeders. And so they're taking all the food out of the water, which makes it look so clean, and they're eating it. And so many of the good fish that we want to be eating all of the life that's in the lake don't have it. And then they excrete all of this nutritious stuff that they took in, and they turn it into fertilizer. And because the lake is so clear, the sun can get down deeper into the water. And not only that, what we have coming off our cities and farms is water that is very nutrient rich. And so we have the perfect combination for really bad stuff. And that bad stuff is, whoop. All right, now how do I go back? One, yeah. Oh, all right, thank you.
So which one did you want to do?
I think one more back. Well, I don't, let me try one more. All right, well, I missed it.
Which way?
No, the next one then. No, forward, okay.
That one?
Yeah. So this is just a quick overview of the food web, and it was not the slide that I thought was going to be next. So I mentioned nutrients, and just a quick overview. This shows you where the phosphorus is coming from, and this is by yield. So it's not so much the loadings, the amount, but the areas that you see here, the darker the color, the more nutrient that's in the runoff. And so when you think about fertilizing your lawn, if you can remember to look to see what's in that fertilizer and try to use phosphorus-free fertilizer, and try to, if you can, not use pesticides, then you could help this problem immensely. This is, and I don't know how it's showing up back there, but this is a beautiful Green Bay after a large flood a year ago, and this is what it looks like. The farmers don't want to lose their soil, but when we have these kinds of storms, if they haven't done the best management practices, we lose it, and that soil carries with it nutrients and phosphorus. So on the left, what you see is what the lake used to look like, and on your right is what you see now. It almost looks like something that could be farmed. But this is what happens when you have that combination of nutrient-rich water, what the zebra mussels have done, and then you have algae that grows along the bottom. And there are divers that go out now that say all the bottom of Lake Michigan looks like this. And it looks green and healthy, and it is probably green, healthy algae, but that's not where we want it. What it does is it creates a condition at the bottom of the lake where botulism, which is always in the lake, can become active. And the fish that feed at the bottom can pick up botulism. And then they swim to the top, where a lot of those migratory birds will eat the fish. And if the botulism has become active, it can kill the birds. We had this problem in the 1960s when we also had the algae and nutrient problem, and unfortunately it has returned. And we have had summers that create the condition where in the fall we have had 7,000 birds that have died and washed up on America's most beautiful spot, Sleeping Bear Dunes. And we now have citizens who can help us with this. The USGS and NOAA have joined together, and if you can see down at the bottom, can everyone read that? There is a website, and they have groups that will monitor the beaches to look for any kinds of dead birds, because the sooner that we get them, the fresher they are, the better we can take some samples and try and figure out some of the puzzling elements of this particular situation. So I told you some good news in the beginning, and unfortunately this is some of the bad news. We're also looking at mercury hotspots. We have mercury in our environment because we have air pollution from coal-fired power plants. And when that mercury lands on the ground or in the water, it is at a state where it's not so detrimental. But there is something that goes on, and it seems to happen more in wetlands and water-rich types of environments where it can turn into methylmercury, be taken up by the fish, and we now have fish advisories for every state in the union. It's not just a Lake Michigan problem. So here is some good news on a contaminant, and that's PCBs. And at one point, we had such a serious problem that the fish advisories were do not eat any fish with PCBs. Now you can see that we're cleaning up our sediments. PCBs are no longer made. Most of, or the vast majority of the uses have been taken out of production. And the prediction is by this model that in 2033, we will not even have to have any kind of fish advisories for PCBs. That would be such a major step forward for those of you who've been around at all and remember some of the problems that we've had with PCBs. The Forest Service owns a lot of land in the northern part of Lake Michigan, and this is just to show that they are doing work on their own land and taking care of it well and making sure that their watersheds are functioning well as well. So one of the interesting things is that we're trying to track climate change. And so for this year, it'll be interesting to see what happens to lake levels. These are lake levels starting in 1860 through 2010. And you can see that the lakes go up and down, but what's happening is they're starting to go up and down much faster. Then we used to have about a 30-year cycle, and now it's very unpredictable. This year that we've all enjoyed so much, there has been no ice on the lake. And when there's no ice on the lake evaporates. And also, if we have big storms, as those storms move across Lake Michigan from Illinois and Wisconsin into Michigan and Indiana, those storms can pick up moisture as it goes. And so that is really not good for the lake levels. It's good maybe for some of the fruit crops on the other side of the lake, but it's not good for lake levels. And when you hear people talk about climate change and they worry about water levels rising in New York and losing beachfront homes in Florida, the exact opposite is really suspected for the Great Lakes. The supposition is we may lose water in the lakes. And there are a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that Lake Michigan, 80% of the water that's in Lake Michigan has spent some time as groundwater. And so we have to remember that water is a cycle, and that water that's in the groundwater also will eventually get into the tributaries and eventually into Lake Michigan. So it's really part of Lake Michigan. And if we have climate change and drought, and then we have a big storm, that water doesn't sink in, and we keep paving over, and so that water rushes off. It takes more pollution with it, and it also doesn't help us store in the groundwater what we need to do, which is some of the future of Lake Michigan. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this, but this is what we used to look like when we had a more sustainable use of our groundwater as well as the lake. And this is what we look like now. And so you can see that we are not on a path towards sustainability. So there's a lot of information, a lot of data-rich studies that have been done. And in the handouts that you got, there is something called the Lake Michigan Wiki, and you can go online and find out a tremendous amount of information. There are a number, in the handouts, a number of websites where you can get in depth, or you can just read the two-page annual reports. Obviously, I don't know all of the stuff that I talked about today. I work with a number of committees and other agencies, and we produce things in a collaborative manner. And again, Sleeping Bear Dunes. The most important thing is that we become aware of things. We take steps. I think it's really important also that we teach the next generation that this is an important resource and to keep it sustainable. Thank you.
The next speaker is Mike Adam. He is the senior biologist for the Lake County Health Department.
I think I can fix it. All right, good evening. I'm the senior biologist at the Lake County Health Department, and I'm in charge of kind of monitoring surface waters of Lake County, so particularly the beaches. So if you go down to the Lake Michigan beaches and they're closed for some particular reason, that's my fault. So you can call me and be angry about that. But we do monitor the beaches during the summertime for safe swimming conditions, and we monitor that on our website. So what I'm going to talk about today is more about kind of drill it down a little bit more. Judy gave a great background about Lake Michigan in general. I'm going to kind of drill it down to more Lake County, some of the information that we've collected over the years and how that kind of relates to water quality issues. I'm also going to talk a little bit about water quantity issues as we get where we get our Lake Michigan drinking water, but also at other parts of the county too. Because I'm going to go out a little bit further than just Lake Michigan. I'm going to talk also about some of the lakes that we have in Lake County. Okay, so Judy had talked a little bit about the watersheds here, and with for those of you, anybody familiar with the Great Lakes Compact? that was put together a few years ago, but it was basically the 8 states that border the Great Lakes plus the 2 Canadian provinces, and they put together this compact, and they said an agreement that said, okay, if we're not going to let someone from California or Nevada come and take our water. So they put together this compact that it's great on paper, whether it's going to be useful in the future or not, but basically it said if you are outside the boundary of the Great Lakes, you cannot get water unless you have everybody agree to it, all the states and all the provinces. So in this case, this is the watershed of the different Great Lakes. And you can see here for Lake Michigan, Illinois has a very, 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 very thin sliver right here that actually goes into Lake Michigan. Basically, it's Green Bay Road east. Which isn't a whole lot, is it? But there's a certain allocation that every state gets that they can pump out of the Great Lakes to use for drinking water. Well, Illinois got a really good deal. We can pump out over 2 billion gallons of water a day out of the lake to give City of Chicago and others drinking water. So if you're in other states and you're on the other side of this border here, you're out of luck, really. I mean, you have to go through a lot to actually get any kind of water. So there's actually court cases and trying to figure out if you want to, if the city of Waukesha, if anybody knows, has gone through a lot of legal battles to try to get water. They're just on the other side of that border. But it's a big issue because a lot of that, Illinois can pump out all that water, and we won't go into all the political side of things, but that had something to do with it, I think. Okay, so this is a map showing the Chicagoland region and who gets what water. So the blue is where you get Lake Michigan water, and obviously Lake Forest. We all on the coast here get Lake Michigan water. We do have some communities in Lake County that get their drinking water from groundwater, and actually a fair amount. And then there are a few people in the Chicagoland region that get their water from surface water. I mean, they actually pull it out of the Fox River, clean it up really well, and then finally be able to drink it. Some of you may also have heard that there are some communities in Lake County that are petitioning to try to get additional Lake Michigan water, Lake Zurich and some of these other communities up here that want some of that 2.1 billion gallons a day. Now, right now, Illinois, I believe, is about at that allocation or a little bit less, so they can allocate some of that money, but you also have communities like down in Will County and Kendall County that are also going, hey, what about us? Can we have some of that allocation? So the Illinois Department of Natural Resources is the agency that's kind of responsible for allocating that. They've got to make the decision of who gets what water. So it's not an easy decision. Again, we can have a whole discussion about that, but we're not going to. But basically, we're going to focus here on Lake County, and this is where the municipalities get their water. These areas in here where you don't see anything, those are mostly unincorporated areas. Those folks are getting groundwater from their wells. Okay, a little bit about the geology of Lake County, and we could go into this one for a long time as well, but basically this is a kind of a cutback of Lake County, whereas this over here is the lake, here's Green Bay Road, here's the Des Plaines River, we're going west. The elevation goes up and down here, here's like Round Lake area, and then Highway 12 on the west side. So when the glaciers came through, they left us all a nice menagerie of different types of clays and silts and sands and gravels, but that's where a lot of the groundwater is. Obviously, it's in many of these different areas. Most of the communities in Lake County, when they get their water from groundwater, are getting it from fairly shallow wells in the sand and gravel layer, sometimes in these other clay and silt layers, but they're fairly shallow. Now, having a shallow groundwater, it can be a good thing in that the water is fairly good, fairly clean water. But the bad thing is that you're shallow and you have a tendency to maybe get easily contaminated. And I'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about some of the water quality issues that we have. Now, some communities have to go deeper for various reasons. And when you go deeper, then you run into some other problems. You run into radium, you run into barium problems. And then from a treatment standpoint, there's additional costs and also health concerns when you look at like radium. Not necessarily getting rid of it. It's more of a dilution factor to get it to a point where it's below the recommendations. So it's really important about quantity issues is that we are seeing some of our communities, especially out western Kenosha County, Lake County, but then also in like McHenry County and some of those others that have a lot of sand and gravel, they're running into some water quantity issues. And they're concerned that in 20 years from now, what are they going to do? They're not going to be able to get Lake Michigan water, but then the groundwater is starting to dry up, and they're already starting to see that in some areas. So there's some serious concerns and planning that's going on right now about what's going to happen into the future. In Lake County, we're okay for right now, but we also need to plan. Now, obviously, in the extreme case, we don't want us to look like the Peril Sea. If anybody read the book Water Wars, this was discussed. The Peril Sea used to be the 4th largest lake in the world, but now 75% of it looks like this. And there's a lot of different reasons, but mismanagement or whatever have you. There's a number of reasons, but many people think of Lake Michigan as an infinite resource, and it certainly is not. And with more and more people demanding the water, as Judy was showing in that map, it has to be somewhere we have to go on to a sustainable path, and we're really not on that right now. Okay, so and I'm going to jump a little bit to more of the lakes in Lake County and water quality issues. As I said, we monitor a lot of the lakes in Lake County, and Lake County is aptly named because of all the, not only the Great Lake, but also all the inland lakes. And we have over 260 lakes that we would call a lake, I think over 6 acres. And a lot of these are fairly high quality, and they're used for a number of different things, obviously human recreation, fishing, but also it's home to a lot of endangered and threatened species that we have, both fish and plants. When the glaciers came through here and when they receded, they kind of clipped northeastern Illinois and gave us some nice glacial lakes. I'll say deep glacial lakes, but in relative context to other glacial lakes that you know of, not really deep. Our deepest lake is Third Lake, which is about 70 feet deep. But for us, that's a pretty deep lake. But a lot of them are really home to these threatened and endangered species that we don't find really in other places in Illinois. So it's really important that we look at these. They also are dependent upon aquatic plants, which we have in many of our lakes. People like to call them weeds. But we do have a number of them that are unique to this part of the world. And also, one of the key things with both of these fish and these plants is that they need good water quality. We turn down the water quality, these plants and fish go away. And so they're kind of the canary in the coal mine, in my opinion, about if we're not taking care of these, then we have some other issues with our own sustainability. But they're also home to a lot of things you don't see, and this is really what drives a lot of our ecosystems in the smaller sense. These plankton, the algae that you don't see, that really is driving the system, because this is the basis of the food chain. If you don't have this, you're not going to have your small fish, you're not going to have your big fish, and you're not going to have your great recreation that you have that many people enjoy. So it's really important to look at what is going on here and how these animals and plants and animals are impacted. Because there are a lot of really neat plants and animals out there, and I always like to point out the mollusks because they are indicative of good water quality. In our lakes, we don't have a lot of mollusks or clams, mostly in our rivers, but in some cases we do. And I always want to show some of the neat adaptations that mussels have. For those of you, hopefully you can see this. This kind of looks like a fish, doesn't it? Well, it's actually part of the clam's, what's called the mantle or the soft tissue. And what it basically is doing is serving as a lure. Because the way it reproduces is that it has to get its glaucidia or its larvae into the gills of a fish, because that's where it lives for part of its life. So how do you do that if you're an animal that sits on the bottom all day? Well, you lure the fish down. And this is what it's doing. It's kind of looks like a fish. There are other clams that look like salamanders or crayfish, and they'll wiggle that thing around, and the fish comes down and checks it out and spits up the larvae, and then they get caught in the gills, and then they swim around for a while. The fish don't know the difference. They swim around for a while, and then all of a sudden, after it grows to a certain point, they'll fall off the gills, and then that's how they've dispersed their young for the next year. So those are kind of cool things that I think people don't always realize. And again, without fresh water, clean fresh water, we're not going to have these, and we're seeing these kind of disappear in some of our lakes as well. Okay, some people don't know we have freshwater sponges in many of our lakes. Again, clean water is really important. Otherwise, we're not going to see those. These are not the kind of sponges you're going to want to use to clean your dishes with, but they are very interesting nonetheless, and we have a few of them in some of our lakes. But of course, we have threats to all that clean water. Certainly inappropriate sediment control issues we see oftentimes around construction sites. Many of them do very, very well, but occasionally you get a situation like this where you have basically this sediment, we call it chocolate milk, leaving the site, and that's going to choke out pretty much anything it's going to come into contact with. Another issue is just in-lake management issues, people wanting basically kind of like a bathtub type of look to their lake. You know, they don't like the weeds, they don't like the algae, they don't want to touch anything, so they just want it all killed. Well, how do you kill all that? You're using a lot of chemicals. And a lot of these chemicals, some of them persist for a while, some of them like copper products are an element, and they'll sink to the bottom and stay in the sediment for long periods of time, and then actually they won't go away. Other ones will deteriorate after a very long period of time. And many of these endangered fish and plants rely a lot on good management within the lakes. Okay, then we have exotic species. Judy had mentioned the quagga mussel and the zebra mussel. Many of our lakes are having problems with other things as well. The common carp, which has been around for a long time, creates a lot of turbidity issues in our lakes, which then suffocates a lot of the fish eggs, as well as it makes it very difficult for sight-feeding fish like bass and bluegill even to feed at all. And then, of course, zebra mussels can actually kill other mussels. We see this a fair amount in our inland lakes. We do have 20 inland lakes that have zebra mussels in them now, and that's increasing every year, and so that is a big concern. And I can echo what Judy had talked about with some of the, the perception is that once you get a zebra mussel in there, your lake clears up, it gets clear, and everybody's happy. But then now we start to see more algae problems. We start to see problems with fish populations, just the age structure. Those are some long-term impacts that we're starting to see that, again, it makes it look not so good once you start looking at it that way. Most of us are aware of the shoreline species like buckthorn and purple loosestrife that have caused lots of problems as well, choking out other species of plants and animals. Okay, so these are just a few exotic animals that we found in lakes over the last years, and yes, we have found an alligator in our lake, lake. We have found piranhas. People throw those in there. They'll throw pretty much anything that's in their fish tank if it gets too big. Fortunately, we haven't had snakeheads. You've heard of snakeheads. Those have caused a problem. We haven't seen any of those. But we do get the usual suspects, like the mussels, grass carp. Actually, we're introduced to actually eat plants and algae, but sometimes that doesn't actually work out so well. And then we also see these things from aquariums like Chinese mystery snail and Asian clams. So obviously the alligator was taken out the next day. So no worries there. Okay, the other thing is, another thing we deal a lot with in our lakes, and it's kind of a threat, is a lot of nutrients. Judy had mentioned it. Nitrogen, phosphorus in particular, that causes algae blooms. Now, algae actually is a good thing. For an aquatic system, you need algae as part of a good aquatic system, but too much of it can cause very, very bad problems. So that balance has kind of been tipped with all the extra nutrients that we see, particularly phosphorus. And Judy alluded to it about phosphorus-free fertilizers. Fortunately, we have in Lake County right now, there's 10 communities that have banned phosphorus fertilizers or non-phosphorus fertilizers. And then actually commercial applicators are supposed to use non-phosphorus fertilizers as well as part of a statewide rule. Many states throughout the Midwest have banned it as well. So basically the industry now is sort of switched over, and if you go into any hardware store, it's very difficult to find phosphorus with fertilizer. So that's a success story, I think, that we can look at, where the industry also kind of went hand in hand in trying to solve an environmental problem. So the phosphorus comes from a lot of different sources, but a lot of times it's from our urban situations. And when we look at some data that we have here in Lake County, we start to see this trend of phosphorus in our lakes. And we're starting to see, some of you may be familiar with these lakes, Druce Lake, Grays Lake, Engages Lake, and Lake Miltmore. But in all cases, we're seeing the phosphorus levels going up as the years go on. And we get past what we call a eutrophic level, which just means nutrient enrichment. We like to see that numbers be around this line, where we are seeing those numbers going up and surpassing that. And in fact, we've got some lakes that are like way up here. unfortunately. So a lot of these are through years and years of runoff going into the lakes. Some of them are from historical wastewater treatment plants that used to not treat water as well as they do now. So those historic inputs are in those lakes and in those sediments, and they're just going to stay there for years and years until we can actually kind of do something to get them out. Well, another concern that we have from a health standpoint, and I'm going to put on my health department hat here, is from the bacteria, what we call cyanobacteria. People like to call it blue-green algae, but it's actually a bacteria that can grow, and it can cause, in some conditions, toxins. Now, not always, but under certain conditions, it can release toxins, and hepatotoxin, which affects the liver, and neurotoxin, which obviously affects nerves. And this is becoming an increasing trend throughout North America, that more and more cyanobacteria blooms are happening, and more severely, and they're causing not only beach closures, but whole lake closures. There's been a few lakes that have been closed for weeks and weeks on end because the bacteria, the cyanobacteria is so bad that you won't let people swim in it. Now, in Lake County, we've had a few of those cases where we've got a big bloom, and we'll actually recommend people not to swim in the lake for a couple days or a week until that subsides. But this is an increasing concern, and there are a lot of research actually going on right now to determine what exactly it is that triggers that. In Lake Michigan, it's usually not quite as bad. There's a different type of algae that is in there. It's more of a green algae, not so much of a blue-green, but this is an increasing concern in Lake Michigan, right along the shoreline, in some of the, especially the bays or the areas that are really, really, there's no water movement. That's where this kind of algae really strive very well. Okay, so this is what we don't want to see. Actually, we didn't stage this picture either. We were on a lake, and there was a can of Miracle-Gro there, and then look at the lake. It's pretty good correlation. And then we don't want to see this, because when you see a lot of algae, that usually means you're going to have wide variations in dissolved oxygen. And the dissolved oxygen obviously is very important for aquatic life and obviously for fish. And in this case, something happened when all the algae died, and that consumes all the oxygen as it's decaying, and we see a big algae or a big fish kill. And we do get these occasionally during the summer here in Lake County. Okay, another issue I want to touch on briefly. Last few things I'm going to touch on are kind of emerging issues that we're seeing to have a problem with here in Lake County and elsewhere throughout the Midwest and in the United States. But chlorides are not something new, but it's starting to get more and more attention. Chlorides are obviously used in, what we're finding them is in rock salt, what we use to keep our roads nice and clean, which we absolutely have to do for safety reasons. But the road salt does contain these chlorides, which can be detrimental to a lot of aquatic life, and it can be toxic to aquatic life as it happens over time. And one of the big things with what we're seeing is the accumulation of chlorides in our water bodies. Chloride's an element, okay? It doesn't break down in anything, nothing eats it. It just it accumulates over time, and the only way to really get rid of it is to flush it out of the system. Well, we're seeing in many of our inland lakes this, again, another increasing trend. Basically, some of the research has shown that if you start to get about 230 milligrams per liter, which is about right here, you start to see death in some aquatic species. We have actually some lakes that are well over 500 milligrams per liter, and obviously they're in very urban environments. So this is something that we've actually been working on, or many people have been working on, with looking at alternatives to road salt or wiser use of road salt, and I think that's really an important thing. For many of you are maybe familiar with beet juice, doing mixtures of beet juice, pre-spraying before a storm happens in order to use less salt when a storm does actually occur. So many of the municipalities have really been leading the way on this issue. And what we're trying to do now is kind of reach out to more of the smaller companies, and, the big box stores, the Walmarts of the world, that will contract to a landscaping company, let's say, and obviously their biggest concern is liability issues. So we have to make sure we're treating the parking lots and not having accidents, but also we need to look at this from a long-term sustainability standpoint. And just to give you a hint here of how bad this can be, this was actually a golf course that was having problems irrigating, and when they were irrigating, all their plants were dying. And they couldn't figure it out. Why are all our plants dying on our golf course? And we came out and tested the pond and said, you have some really high chloride. You need to kind of get rid of it or find an alternative source. So they drained part of the pond, and you can see this is like a bathtub ring of salt that's all around the shoreline from all the years of accumulation. So what they ended up having to do was actually drill a new well just for irrigation. So that kind of gets back to one of the first things I was talking about was water quantity issues. So if we have more and more wells being drilled for irrigation purposes, that means potentially less for drinking water issues. So these are things we have to kind of be thinking about balancing out in the long term. One other thing quickly, pharmaceuticals and personal care products are showing up in our water bodies. Some of you may have heard stories of female fish turning into male fish. That's a reality. That does happen, and there's concern about that in the long term. Again, many of our pharmaceutical products that we use that go down the toilet don't necessarily get cleaned up at the treatment plant, so they end up going into our water bodies. And then that affects the fish. Now, it may not necessarily affect us so much as if we're just playing in the water or water skiing or whatever, but for a fish or an aquatic organism that you're in the water 24 hours a day, that's going to have an impact. So Judy mentioned about the mercury in a lot of our fish, and also about some of the PCBs and other contaminants that we have in many of our rivers and also harbors. And so, here's the big message is there's more and more campaigns about turning in your pharmaceuticals, getting them recycled and properly disposed of instead of, we always used to just flush them down the toilet. That was the thing you do. Now it's more about, disposing them in the garbage or taking them to a place. A lot of pharmacies are now accepting them. The police stations are accepting them, so it's becoming more and more, but we just need to get that word out because these aren't easy, and if they are treatable, they're very difficult to get out of the water. Another one, the last thing I'm going to talk about are PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons. There are thousands of PAHs, but it's becoming, there's more research coming out in our water bodies showing that high levels of these in some areas, and some of these PAHs do cause human cancers. Carcinogens, and again, a lot of impact on aquatic life. You can't really see it very well, but this is like a mad tom or a bullhead type of fish with an ulcer on here that is part of what they attribute to a lot of the PAHs impact on these aquatic systems. A lot of frog species are not able to breed properly because of these high levels, and PAHs can come from a lot of different sources, but one of the main sources that they're identifying are from sealants from our driveways and our parking lots. Sealants can kind of be in a couple different forms. They can be in what's called a coal tar sealant, and one can be, and also in what's called an asphalt sealant. The asphalt sealant is much better for the environment, although in a relative sense. But coal tar are the ones that really are the targets right now, and there are some legislation in different states on trying to get this banned. I think the state of Washington has banned it. There's a bill, and I know it's talked about in Illinois and in Wisconsin and Minnesota. So these are some issues, and one of the big things is not necessarily, it's on the pavement and it's washing into our water bodies, but also when you get kids and other people in parking lots or in playgrounds are now going into houses, they're finding PAHs in houses, the dust that people are breathing in. So it's a concern from a public health standpoint as well. So I think that's all I have. It is. So I'm going to turn it over to John.
Our next speaker, John Santel, President of Lake Forest Open Lands.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I get to talk about two things I'm very passionate about: open space in our wild places and water. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. Let me see here. Oh, the other one? This is the one? So what I'd like to do tonight is this one right here?
Just press it.
Oh, I got you.
And if you want to go back, press it here. It's right on the rim.
It's on the
not
rim
in
there.
the
Got it.
center.
Okay. So what I'd like to do is talk to you tonight about, first of all, I'll give you a little bit of background on Lake Forest Open Lands. We are the local land trust. We're the local conservation organization, and although everybody knows our name, they might not know what we do, so I thought I'd just give you a little history on that. Secondly, I want to talk about conservation, this importance of water that we have in our area. We are stewards of an incredible resource. Want to sort of dovetail with what Judy and Mike were talking about and bring it sort of in a global perspective, and then talk about how our land use has affected water over the history of Illinois and the whole Mississippi River Basin, and also talk about the importance of wetlands and what we can do right now to make a difference. Okay, so quickly, Lake Forest Open Lands, 45 years old, and we're really devoted to the stewardship of the unique natural landscapes and to ensuring that all of our generations have a meaningful, lasting connection to nature. We're really about saving it, but more importantly, not just saving it, but appreciating it and making sure the next generation appreciates it as we do. I like to always start talking about Open Lands, about the vision of the people who founded this organization. We're 45 years old, and it's incredible to think that when this organization was started, it is before the Clean Air Act, before the Clean Water Act, 5 years before Earth Day was founded. There was really no national land trusts really formed. And there was a few small visionaries that decided to save what we have in Lake Forest, and what they did back then was really quite remarkable. And in most things in terms of conservation start with small grassroots organizations like that. You know, I also like to say that our historic landscape helps to contribute to our sense of place. We look at our open spaces here in Lake Forest not unlike looking at Market Square. I mean, it really defines who we are as a community. I think we need new batteries. I'll just put quickly, a remarkable legacy. Lake Forest Open Lands has 840 acres that we've preserved. We are the first accredited land trust in Illinois. That's the highest level of recognition you can get from the national body. We have educated close to 40,000 now children in our community. We're considered a national leader. Much of what we do is modeled by other land trusts. We have 2 Illinois nature preserves right in our community. A lot of people don't realize it's not just the beauty of the property, but it's of really quite incredible value. Nature preserves are the highest level of distinction and protection that a piece of property can get in our community. We have, for example, in McCormick Preserve, there are 15 threatened and endangered species there. So we have important biodiversity, and of course we're an independent nonprofit. I have too many charts, so I'm going to whip through them here so we can get to the good stuff, which is water. We not only protect the land, but we take care of the land. It's a big job. We have 10 full-time, we have 4 full-time land managers, and we have 6 to 10 interns every year that manage the land, and we do a lot of partnerships to do so. Of course, we have our Bagpipes and Bonfire. This is the shameless plug for Bagpipes and Bonfire. September 23rd. Hope you'll attend. It's a wonderful, it's really when the shadows start to lengthen, the kids go back to school, it's time for Bagpipes and Bonfire. We hope you certainly will join us. It's a wonderful day out on the lawn. And we believe that educating children, as Judy said, is really how to protect water and our land going forward. Richard Louv says, time in nature is not leisure time. It's an essential investment in our children's health. They are the people who will take care of our planet going forward. That's key to our mission. Let me get right to water and wetlands. What are the key environmental problems we are facing today? Climate change, habitat and biodiversity loss, invasive species, flooding, hypoxia in the oceans, and water. And really, water, I believe, is the defining conservation issue of the next 50 years. All of the above really impact or are driven by water. We tend to forget, Jacques Cousteau said it best, we tend to forget that the water cycle and the life cycle are one. We have to take care of our water or we can't take care of ourselves. So around the world, the supply of fresh water is becoming a defining issue of global politics and economic development. There's only so much of it. If China runs out of clean fresh water, they're going to go get it. And I think we need to think about that. Everything depends on water. All life depends on water. People, animals, trout, plants, bacteria. Everything depends on water, and not just water, but clean water. So, 70% of the Earth's surface, fortunately, 70% of the Earth's surface is water. Unfortunately, 97% of the Earth's water is salt water, and only 3% of the Earth's water is what we call fresh water. And if you slice this a different way, this thing called freshwater can be kind of hard to come by. About 70% of it is in ice caps and glaciers. About 30% of it is in the ground. And 0.03% of it is what we call surface freshwater. That would be rivers, streams, lakes, wetlands. So if you look at it a different way, if you took all the water in the world and put it in a bucket, all the fresh water in the world would be about that teaspoonful. And if you looked at all the surface fresh water, it's about the size of that droplet. And then keep in mind that just because it says it's fresh water, it doesn't mean that it's clean fresh water. It just means it's fresh water. So like most things in life, you know, life's not fair. There's over 1 billion people worldwide who lack access to clean drinking water. We don't think a lot about it, but in other parts of the world, they go to war over it, they pray to it, they hoard it, they'll walk miles for it. They treat clean fresh water like gold. Well, how do we treat our fresh water? And like most resources, they're not only always distributed fairly in the world. The Middle East has 68% or 2/3 of our current proven crude oil reserves, but they have very little surface fresh water. Well, if you look at the Midwest, we have 20% of the world's total surface fresh water. So think 50 years down the road, where would you rather be living? All right, so why are we the great recipients of this wonderful gift of fresh water? Well, we were given the great geologic gift in the Midwest. We're right in the hub of the whole thing. If you look at the continental U.S., on the east you have mountains, on the west you have mountains. All the fresh water runs right down the middle from the Great Lakes through all the tributaries right down to the Gulf of Mexico. And Illinois itself was blessed once upon a time with over 8.2 million acres of wetlands, which are really the resource or really the storage capacity for our fresh water. But we don't have those wetlands now. Where did they all go? Well, believe it or not, Illinois was once called the duck capital of the world. We were considered the world's duck capital. Really, if you think about it, we're called the prairie state. We should be called the wetland state because we honestly used to be the wetland state. So we have all these wetlands, the rivers and the lakes and the streams all trickle down into the mighty Mississippi, which heads down to the Gulf. So wetlands were crucial reservoirs, filters, buffers, and habitats. They were the hub for everything that lives or depends on fresh water. Wetlands were really the lungs of our water, of our hydrologic cycle. So 200 years ago, fresh water was plentiful, biodiversity was abundant, and wetlands were everywhere. But today, most are gone. Right now, we only have 10% of Illinois' pre-settlement wetlands still in existence. Why did that happen? I always like to say it's because economics controls the environment. And so when you talk about your power to vote, economics controls the environment, and what we do with our water and our environment is really driven by your vote. A little history lesson. So how did we lose all our wetlands and how did economics control the environment? Well, when the Europeans arrived in America, they believed that the land was worth more dry than wet. And you can see why. They arrived here, they see these swamps, you know, creature from the Black Lagoon, mosquitoes, and they think if I could get this land dry, it would be incredibly productive farmland. So they set about doing just that. And this is what we did in Illinois and even in Lake Forest. So they drained the wetlands to make their land more valuable. They channeled rivers to make them run deeper and faster. The goal was, let's get the water off the landscape as quickly as we can. And really that was what the Army Corps of Engineers was designed to do. One was to ensure transportation and navigation, and secondly, to get the water off the land as quickly as possible. But that's not the right thing to do to protect our water supply. They built levees and dams to keep the water off the land. We have hundreds of thousands of miles of levees all throughout the Mississippi River Basin, from the Dakotas, you know, to Pennsylvania and down to the Gulf. And they built drainage systems to make sure the land stayed dry. And we still have many, many drain tiles throughout Lake County and Lake Forest and all the way down to the Gulf to keep our farms dry. And then they said, well, how can I make my farm even more profitable, my land even more economically valuable? And they said, well, I can apply massive amounts of chemicals onto my land and it will increase my yield. And this whole strategy was extremely successful. This is why Illinois and the Midwest is the breadbasket of the world, because we have changed our land use and how we use our land. And of course, it's not just the farms in the rural areas that we did this. We did this in our cities. Chicago, really built on a wetland. Northern Indiana, is really one of the largest wetlands in the entire world. And so again, even in urban areas and factories, we believe that the land was worth more dry than wet. Oops. So now, 150 years later, we're starting to see the very drastic unintended consequences of our actions. Water contamination, more flooding, more habitat destruction, restricted biodiversity, climate change, and as Mike talked about, hypoxia. Hypoxia. So as Mike talked about, hypoxia is really, you may have heard of the dead zone in the Gulf. It's really a eutrophic zone of about the size of New Jersey. It changes in size and scale, but it's really an area that is devoid of life in the Gulf of Mexico because there's no oxygen. All the nutrients from the farms rush down to the Gulf. Phytoplankton grows when it dies. It creates an oxygen vacuum. And so this is an area, so if you're a fish, you can swim out of it, but you can't breed in the estuaries. And if you're a mollusk or some other type of creature, you can't get out of that zone. So Illinois right now is the #1 contributor to the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And the Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago, I believe, Judy, I was asking Judy, I believe is the #1 point source contributor in Illinois of nutrients into our waterways. And the hypoxic issue is a growing problem of global proportions. There are over 200 estuaries right now that are affected by hypoxia. And right now, as soon as Africa and South America get on the radar with more modern farming practices and start using the same amount of fertilizer that we use to make our farms successful, this will grow dramatically. And so you talk about, so what's the solution? Well, if economics controls the environment, I think it's safe to say economics has to cure the environment. And so we need to show people the economic reasons and the value of our natural landscape, of protecting our water, of keeping our land, keeping our open lands, of keeping our land use, using our land differently. So how do you fix these big freshwater problems? Well, there's really 3 ways to do it. First of all, conservation. Conservation works. Use less water. It's very successful. But we have problems of large scale, so how are we going to clean our water? Well, chemical treatment. Chemical treatment works. It cleans the water. But the problem with chemical treatment is, first of all, it's very expensive, and secondly, it uses a lot of energy. So the third option is, what about wetland restoration? What about treating our water naturally, keeping it on the land longer? Can we restore wetlands? Yes, we can. A restored wetland is never as good. It can never achieve the same function as an original wetland. But you can get wetlands restored and they can get 75–80% function. This is an example of a farm down in central Illinois, 2,600 acres. It was farmed for 80 to 90 years. And the Wetlands Initiative, the organization I used to work for, turned off the pumps. And within 2 years, it was a wetland like this. And it is probably one of the finest wetland restorations in the Midwest. Extremely robust, now an Illinois Nature Preserve. What's incredible is seeds, plant seeds that were buried under the soil for over 80, 90 years, as soon as they got wet again, they took the opportunity and they took off. And you can restore wetlands. So how do wetlands work? I mean, why is doing a wetland going to help solve our water problems? Well, wetlands are amazing ecosystems. First of all, they convert nitrogen into a harmless gas. Secondly, they store phosphorus in sediments under the water. Thirdly, they sequester carbon and peat. When you go to peat bogs, that's really carbon. So in a wetland, they're just big carbon sinks. They store floodwaters. That's critical, so storing floodwaters. They also create habitat, support biodiversity, and provide recreational opportunities for all. So if we restore wetlands, clean water can be plentiful again, drinkable, swimmable, fishable. Nature can be abundant and diverse again. The estuaries of the world can breathe again. So what I'd like to do is take it down to sort of a local level and talk about wetlands, open lands, and our community, then give you some suggestions of things you can do to help save water. We talked about Illinois was a wetland community. Lake Forest really used to be a wetland community. This is a historical map of the wetlands in Lake Forest. You can see here, and you gauge wetlands by, we can tell the wetlands are here by the soils. Hydric soils, they never change their sort of chemical components, so we know. There were close to 3,000 acres of wetlands here in Lake Forest. And this is what it looks like today. So we've lost most of our wetlands. I mean, all this water either used to drain towards Lake Michigan, some of it drained down toward the Mississippi River Basin, but now we get it off the land as quickly as possible. But it's better to keep that water on the land. Where do we find our wetlands? Well, basically, it's simple to define a wetland. A wetland is anywhere where land and water meet. They're in the edges of standing water, in the edges of flowing water, where runoff is collected in basins, where groundwater surfaces, where streams and rivers regularly flood. Lake Forest and Lake Forest Open Lands has all of these, and we need more of them. Oops. Wetland simplified. How do you know if it's a wetland? First of all, wetland plants in it. Secondly, wetland soils like I talked about. And thirdly, wetland hydrology. Basically, a wetland doesn't have, you don't have to see water for it to be a wetland. A wetland, if you have water within 1 foot of the surface of the ground for a period of time, it's really considered a wetland. Just quickly, there's different types of freshwater wetlands, and I won't take you through all those. I think we know marshes and swamps and floodplains and fens, seeps. We have them all in town. Why are wetlands so important? Wetlands, first, they're among the most productive ecosystems on Earth. And so when ecologists look at ecosystems, they determine sort of the complexity of the ecosystem and the interrelationship of all the creatures. Wetlands rival the rainforest in terms of their productivity, as opposed to, say, a desert or a deep ocean, which are really not very productive ecosystems. Secondly, they filter and they cleanse the water. They take nutrients out, they control sediments, and they refresh our groundwater. Thirdly, they reduce flooding. Flooding is a big deal, not only in Illinois, but throughout the Mississippi River Basin. Since the 1950s, our country has spent about $90 billion on flood control and flood damages. And it's incredible when you look at the charts that the more dollars we put into flood control, it's about threefold the flood damage. So obviously our flood control measures do not work. We need to allow the water to go back on the land. Wetlands also provide food and habitat. Some interesting facts: the majority of all animal species are wetland dependent to some extent. Wetlands are a key base in the food chain. Secondly, about 25% of all land in Illinois once was wetland. And thirdly, a little fact here, half of all North American bird species depend on wetlands for survival. And Judy talked about how the birds are coming through the Illinois flyway and through the Lake Michigan flyway. Well, that's a classic example. Why are wetlands important to our community? First of all, it's part of our heritage. We were a wetland community. Secondly, while we can't go back in time, what we do have is very important. Every wetland in our community is very important, and anything that can be, any way that we can keep water on the land is very important. We are able to restore some of what was lost, and we certainly want to save what we have left. So when we see about large developments in town coming in, and they're talking about doing wetland mitigation or putting in retention basins, these sort of things, we need to think a little harder. We need to think about having wetland mitigation in our town. We need to think about ways to limit parking structures. We need to think about ways to keep more open space, let the land take care of the water instead of sending it down the storm sewers to Lake Michigan or down to the Mississippi River. When we restore our wetlands, we enhance the value of our preserves. The natural infrastructure saves us money. It enhances our city. And wetlands improve our watershed and in turn improve our water quality. Quickly, some wetlands around town. This is Dixon Wetland, which is a shallow marsh out in Shaw Prairie, and these pictures are all kind of stark before the wetland pops for the year. We have Shaw Spring. This is really interesting. If you go to Shaw Prairie, this is a spring that they were putting in some lines a number of years ago, some power lines, and they actually struck a spring. So this is pure water coming right out of the aquifer, and then it drains down through Shaw Prairie. I mean, you could, in theory, drink that water probably right out of the spring. It would be fine. It's that clean. I think we need new batteries here. There we go. Oops. Well, this is the Skokie River, and I like to show this picture because see how the Skokie River is straight? The Skokie River originally wasn't straight. It was made straight to get the water off the land as quickly as possible, and that's a problem because when it starts raging down, it takes all the sediment with it, it causes erosion, that sort of thing. What we should really do with the Skokie River is make it meander again. We should put some riffle structures in there. We should take the edges and not channelize them so much, make them softer. It would make it much more beautiful. It would improve water quality. It would reduce flooding. When I see things like this, a lot of times people say, well, we got to get these trees out of the river. It's causing a problem. This is actually not such a bad thing. It slows the water down. We'd like to see more of that, oxygenate the water. So these are actually good things. Let's see here. Again, this is an example of the Skokie River and erosion in the Skokie River. That's all high-quality soil that's being flushed down, ultimately gets to the Mississippi. We need to take these edges and make them more shallow, slow the water down, and erosion is all through the Skokie River. This is McLaughlin Meadow, a shallow marsh here right by the Bark Trail. This is actually a very high-quality wetland right here, right now, and if you drive by there, you can hear the chorus frogs there chirping like anything right now. This is a wetland over in West Skokie Preserve. This is the West Skokie River. Same problems here as with the other place. West Skokie again. Here's Middle Fork Savannah. This is a nice little pothole marsh here that we have, a seasonal pothole marsh, and the birds just love it. Here's the river at Melody, a nice turn there. That's actually a nice little bend in the river. This is behind 10 West, right across from Deer Path. This is actually a nice bog here. We don't have a lot of these in town. That's a nice example. And there's our Jen Jensen Pond over at Melody Preserve. I invite you to come visit. That's a wonderful place to come walk around and enjoy Melody Nature Preserve. So, Patrick's Puddle actually was something, it was just a degraded piece of ground, and we had some volunteers get together and they turned it back into a wetland, and it's a wonderful place where kids can go and adults can go, and you can see all kinds of aquatic life. So what can we do here? So when we take away from tonight, what can we do? We've heard a lot about what's going on, what's wrong with our water, what's right with our water. What can we do? Well, I put together my top 15 list of things you can do to make a difference. First of all, landscape your yard in native plants. Native plants are from here. They don't need the water. You don't even have to water them all. They'll take care of themselves. So I encourage you to do as much native landscaping as you can in your yard. Have a smaller lawn and water it less. It's easy to do. Your lawn will be just fine, and it saves a lot of water. Don't fertilizer. If you do, use non-toxic fertilizers. Avoid chemicals. If you have problems with your lawn, mow it a little higher and water it less, and the weeds will disappear and the lawn will take over. Detach your rain gutters if they're still attached, and just let the water somehow get onto the land, or use a rain barrel. There's no reason to send all that rainwater back into the storm sewer system. As Judy talked about, use phosphorus-free detergents. Take shorter showers. Don't buy bottled water. Refill your container. Limit the use of your disposal in your sink. Compost as much as possible. No reason to send that down into the treatment plants. Don't flush pharmaceuticals down the toilet or the sink. Mike talked about that. And never dump items like paint, soap, antifreeze, or oil down storm drains. We all think that's common sense. It's amazing how many people still do that today and say it's just out of sight, out of mind. Leave the clippings on your lawn. They are the best fertilizer you can have, and they will decompose fine, and you don't have to worry about emptying your lawn bag. Stop leaky faucets, showers, and toilets. There's been studies that say a running toilet can waste around 2 gallons of water per minute. Importantly, vote for policies and politicians who support water protection and access to water. I mean, if economics controls the environment, we know that the voting public can control the economics. And finally, remember that wetlands are good for clean water, so don't drain your wetland, embrace your wetland. So, thank you very much.
Wow, what incredibly well-informed experts, and I'm sure we've all learned an awful lot from this presentation. It's just fabulous. How many minutes are we going to have for questions, Mary? Oh, infinite number. Okay. So are there questions? And perhaps our speakers would like to take a seat here. I'll repeat the questions so that everyone can hear them and so that we can get them on the camera. But does anyone have a question? Yes, sir.
This is a question for Judy Beck. Apparently the quagga mussel has done a good job of eliminating zebra mussel. Is there anything that might eliminate the quagga mussel?
The question is, the quagga mussel has done a good job eliminating the zebra mussel. Is there something that can perhaps eliminate the quagga mussel? Am I pronouncing that correctly? That's a new term for me.
That's correct. So one of the things we're doing now is doing some research on that. What we try to do a lot with invasives that we have is we try to figure out what attracts the male to the female and see if we can't make them not so attractive to each other so that we're not continually reproducing. People have tried to figure out if there's some way that we might be able to use them for some good purpose. And I don't think I mentioned how the 185 invasive species that are in the Great Lakes, how they got here. The vast majority of them came in ballast water from ships from the Black Sea and some of the Baltic nations, and we've been taking a lot of actions nationally and also internationally, and we're trying to really dry that up. That's not going to help us with the 185 that are here, and we need to really be careful about that, because once they're here, you know, then we get the question, well, what do you do about them? And we really don't know. So there is research going on, and we hope that we'll be able to do something about them.
Question in the back, Marion.
Question on the ballast water. I'm glad you brought it up. I was just hearing on the radio recently that we have once again failed to pass ballast water controls because the industry said we can't afford it. How long is it, in your mind, as a long-term administrator of the EPA, is it going to take to pass safe ballast water?
The question, it has to do with ballast water. The questioner had heard recently that we've again failed to pass any legislation that controls ballast water, and the questioner is asking the EPA how long will it take before we can pass legislation that will effectively control ballast water.
So I'm not sure what you heard, because we do have a lot of safeguards in place now where the water does need to be treated. But what I would like to point out is one way that we get national legislation is when states take action, and some of our states have taken some action, and so that helps to move the need for federal legislation, because industry doesn't like to deal with, you know, 13 or 20 different state laws. But also for the ballast water, this is an international problem, and we have to work with Canada because the ships come in through the waters that are shared by the U.S. and Canada. So basically, it is an international problem, and just like John showed the picture of around the world, there's hypoxic zones everywhere. Well, there's a lot of our species have been taken to other places, and then they're the invasive species in other places in the world. And so this is, it's an opportunity for us to learn about this very serious problem that some people have even said is not a problem, that species have always moved, but what happens when you drop a lot of one type in, and there's no, they are just able to reproduce. They don't have any enemies, and they take over, as you saw in the pictures of Lake Michigan.
Is there another question? Yes.
For typical suburban ponds, I think there's a retention pond. Is there a source of information for, like, the homeowners association for best practices or a guideline for reducing chemical use and managing those ponds better?
The question is, the typical suburban pond, is there information available to homeowners as to how to most effectively manage those ponds?
Yeah, and I'll take that question, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's actually going to be a homeowners association workshop at Libertyville. I think it's April, I'm not exactly sure. It's in April sometime at the Central Permit Facility. And it's put on by Lake County Stormwater Management Commission. and they put it on every year, and it's a really great seminar. It just lasts a couple hours at night, and they talk about these various things, about how to maintain a detention pond, how to properly do the maintenance on it, and looking at also long-term impacts. And I think that's a big thing that we've seen in many of our communities where there's a development that comes in, developer comes in, builds the development, has a detention pond, then walks away, and the people who live in that association have no idea that they have to maintain that, and as well as that can be very expensive, because over time, especially if you have to dredge it or really do some serious work to it, that's a lot of money, and most associations aren't ready for that kind of a price tag. So that would be a good place to start. My group as well at the health department, we could provide some information to you about maintenance, but that would be a really great place to start, and I think it's next month, so we can get that information to you.
Great. Way in the back.
Yes, there's several hundred homes in Lake County that still have their own private well. I'm very concerned about how rapidly the water table is dropping and the quality of water that they're getting from their own private wells. Can you tell me anything about the rapid water drop?
The question is, many homes in Lake County still have their own wells, and the questioner is concerned about lowering the water table through these wells, and also with the quality of the water that may be coming out of these wells.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because in many of these wells, we really don't have a great idea of what's the aquifer is below it. We've actually engaged the Illinois Geological Service to do some mapping, actually some groundwater mapping in certain parts of the county, to identify how much water is there, where is it, what kind of underlying bedrock or what have you is under there, so to get an idea of this quantity issue as we look out 20, 30, 40 years from now, is there going to be enough water for these private residents? Because anytime let's say a municipality has to drill a new well, it's a large capacity well, and what happens is you get what's called a cone of depression around that well, so everybody else's, the water table kind of drops around that well, and that can cause problems. And as far as legal issues, if that happens, there's not a lot to stand on. Now, as far as quality goes, you can certainly have your well tested. In fact, just this week we were having, at the health department, we have a lab in Libertyville where you could bring your water to have it tested for a reduced rate. And so there's a number of parameters that we can run, as well as in some of the what we call non-community waters. The health department does the testing, so we'll take a look at those every so often to make sure that the quality is good. But certainly those wells that are shallow wells are of a concern to us, because they can get inundated by some, if we have issues like with chlorides. I talked about chlorides, and we have had some wells that they've had to drill new wells because they've gotten a little too much salt into their own well.
Can I comment on that
Certainly.
as well? So I know you look out at the big lake and you think that there's plenty of water there, but remember what I said, that 80% of the water that's in Lake Michigan spent some time as groundwater. And one of the things that we see are these cones of depression from Chicago all the way up to Milwaukee. And we are mining that water. We understand what it is to mine gold. Well, we are mining our water. The water that we're pumping out is not water that went in there in the last few years. It's hundreds of thousands, maybe 1,000 years old. And now when it rains, where does that water go? It runs off our driveway, picking up the PAHs along the way, and it rushes into the streams and then continues to rush along and do damage along the way. So the system that we have now is not sustainable, and we need to start fixing that system. We need to have driveway materials where the water can sink in. People need to have rain gardens. We really need to continually think about how we can take the system. And we have a terminology for it now, and it's called green infrastructure. as opposed to what we have now, which is gray infrastructure. And these types of green infrastructure, there's been a lot of new types of materials that have been developed, and they're being tried out and they're working well. And so in Glenview, we have put in a porous pavement parking lot. And when you look at it, you think, oh, it's a really bad concrete job, is what it looks like. But what it is, it's almost like making concrete with popcorn in it, and there's all kinds of holes. And then the underlayment is levels of gravel so that it does capture the water and it takes it down. And yes, every year or two, you're going to have to actually go out and vacuum that parking lot to make sure those pores are still open. But now we have parking lots where we have to reseal them. So again, we need to move from that green, from that gray infrastructure to the green infrastructure.
Yes.
This is a two-part legal question. One, Mike had alluded to the agreement between the provinces of Canada and the states that touch the Great Lakes. I'm aware legally that there are western states making a play for our water. So wondering what we as constituents can do to encourage our representatives to protect our water from the natural play for it from large agricultural states like California and Arizona, as well as the rest of the western states that are in deep trouble, as we all know. Secondly, we're talking, both Mike and Judy were addressing the issue of wells with private landowners. In a lot of western states, your water isn't yours. Colorado's passed laws, but I'm wondering, do you see a future that would include water courts and changes in legislation as to the quote-unquote ownership of water, instead of it being where it falls, that it would go to the greater good as opposed to the landowner, to their use?
A two-part question was asked. First of all, what can we do as constituents to encourage some of our legislators to help protect our water rights from especially some of the western states who we know are in deep trouble and would love to have access to some of the water coming out of the Great Lakes, was number one. And number two, could we at some point have a state where we have specific water rights that you even, such as the state of Colorado has, where you actually buy and purchase water rights rather than it just being where it falls, it's yours? Who wants to tackle that question?
Well, the legislation that we had, the compact, and this was the second one. The first one we had didn't have teeth in it. The second one did. It took a long time to get it there. And one of the things that was built into it was that each state had to have a conservation plan as well. And so we're sitting on the water mine, the gold mine, whatever you want to call it. So I think, though, it's important that we show the rest of the country that we're good stewards of it and that we conserve water. And one of the things that the mayors of the Great Lakes cities are doing is they have an organization, and that's one of the tenets that they have agreed to, is that they are going to try to institute many more water conservation measures. And that's a hard sell in an area where we seem to be water rich. But it will also help us in courts if we can say, well, look what we have, our own communities and citizens have done, and that's really important. Out west has always been different, and I don't know it well enough to comment on it. I will tell you, though, that one of the water trivia things that I've always thought was really interesting is we have an agreement with Mexico. And so much of the Colorado River is supposed to cross the border into Mexico. And there are some years where we have to send trucks full of water. and pour it in so that we can make our treaty obligations. That's, I guess, a good definition of a non-sustainable system.
Other questions?
I guess I was just going to maybe address the
sorry.
second part of that question too, because I think what you talked about would be a great idea if it could happen. I mean, I hate to be a pessimist, but I don't see that happening with just the history of what we've had in Illinois. And we kind of run into this problem even on simple things like in our lakes, where you know, the bottom ownership is owned by 50 people and it's split up like a piece of pie. And just to get, I think we've looked at in the past trying to get at least that sort of more in tune to like neighboring states like Wisconsin, where the state kind of dictates more of that, when that just kind of ran into a brick wall. So I think until there's a disaster or something that really is going to change people's or sway the opinion.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
I was amazed at how much Mississippi River has a biomass of carp, particularly the Asian and the bighead carp. And the television show that I watched on Discovery said 70 to 80% of all biomass, talking about living stuff in our water of the Mississippi Valley, is carp. With that kind of production, don't you think it's a good idea to start putting some kind of harvesting program instead of studying it to death with millions and millions of dollars being spent, when in fact we should maybe start to harvest them?
The question has to do with the questionnaire had heard that there is a tremendous biomass of carp in the Mississippi River and the Mississippi waterways. As much as 80% of those waterways are carp biomass. And can't we do something perhaps with all of that carp?
Well, it just so happens that the governor and the head of the Illinois DNR think the same way. A couple of years ago, they had a contingency of some of the Asian countries come over, and they think that that our carp taste better than it does even though these are Asian carp, than it does in their country, probably because our waterways are not as polluted. And I can't tell this story as good as Todd Main, who works for the Illinois DNR, does. And some people, I know that Midge was at the same meeting I was. And but there's a problem with the carp because they're very bony, and it's hard to get the bones out, and so it's hard to then, how are you going to prepare it, and it's labor intensive to get it into a can. And so he tells the story of they brought a couple of Cajun chefs to the to Chicago area because, number one, they'll eat anything, and number two, they're very creative. And so they came up with a way of steaming the carp that allowed you to pull out the bone framework, the skeleton, so that it was easy to package it. And so as far as I know, I think that's underway, and that people in Asia will be eating, but I have to tell you that they're not going to call it Mississippi River carp. They're going to call it Great Lakes carp, because I guess the Great Lakes are, you know, like a cut above, and so.
We used to always joke, we did a lot of work down the Mississippi River Basin, and carp's a real problem. It wasn't our wetlands. We used to joke that we're one good recipe away from solving the carp problem. But, you know, we do ship a lot of carp overseas. A lot of carp is ground up for fertilizer right now. But the risk in setting up production facilities, which they're doing to process carp then, is economics drives the environment. So these places will be prepared to fish carp. So there's no real incentive to eradicate carp. Now, eradicating carp may be a dream that's unattainable, but we have to be careful of that. But certainly fishing them out right now is one way to do it. But a lot of carp it's not efficient for the fishermen to go into backwater lakes, backwater streams, and fish the carp out. It's just a low it's a low probability thing for them, so they will fish the Illinois River for carp. They also, incidentally, are hunting carp now. They have hunting excursions with bow and arrows where you will go down the Illinois River. When the carp jump, the people have a string on their bow and arrow, and they shoot the carp out of the air. And people pay outfitters to take them on carp hunting excursions.
Are there other questions? Yes.
Yeah, question for Mike about, you had mentioned there are 10 communities in Lake County that have banned phosphorus fertilizers. Why is it so hard to ban it, and how fast can we get to more than 10%?
Question is about banning phosphorus in fertilizers. Mike mentioned there were 10 communities that have now banned phosphorus in fertilizer. Why can't we spread the word and get more communities to ban the phosphorus?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and Antioch actually was the first community to ban it in Lake County. In fact, I think in Illinois. And then quickly we had several other Round Lake communities and several others have followed suit. And I think part of the reason why some of the communities did not, and one of the oppositions to doing it was the enforceability factor, and people are saying, well, why should we create an ordinance that is really difficult to enforce, if not unenforceable? And really the thing about that is you're obviously an education standpoint, the states of Minnesota, Wisconsin, they've banned it totally, and they haven't had any enforcement issues. But they're not, they don't have to hire extra police to run around people's yards and garages figuring out if they've actually has phosphorus fertilizer. But it's really kind of getting it at the source, that is where they're selling it. And really in the last few years we haven't had any communities really kind of step forward, and in part because of what I had mentioned before is that the industry kind of has sort of gone along with it, and they've kind of said, hey, instead of making a different phosphorus fertilizer for Wisconsin and for Minnesota and for parts of Illinois and parts of, let's just get it out of our formula, because it's cost them money to put the phosphorus in the formula. And really your lawns, for the most part, don't need phosphorus. I mean, they need the nitrogen, certainly, and in some cases they do need phosphorus, and there are exemptions in all these ordinances that if you do need or prove with a soil test that you need phosphorus, yes, you can use it. But I think that's kind of where it's kind of stopped right now, is that you go in, like I said, you go into the hardware stores and it's hard to find a phosphorus, a fertilizer with phosphorus in it. So while we'd like to see that, there have been discussions about going statewide with the ban, and I think it's just sort of lost a little momentum right now because it's hard to actually find it.
Other questions? Yes.
I just had a comment. I believe the city of Chicago has also banned phosphorus in laundry detergent, which is, as John mentioned, in what you can do. And laundry detergent is something we all use on a daily basis. Some people don't have lawns, but that's one place I know.
Questioner points out that she believes the city of Chicago has banned phosphorus in laundry detergents.
So that ban was put into place a long time ago, and that was really throughout the Great Lakes. And then, and actually Indiana was the first state to pass that. And then in 2008, the Indiana legislature passed an additional ban, and that was to take phosphorus out of dishwashing detergent. And it was really some interesting statistics, because when they did the ban in the washing machine detergent, very few people had automatic dishwashers, and it wasn't an issue. But over a couple of decades, we now have upwards in the 70% or more of our homes that have automatic dishwashers. So the industry came in and negotiated with the governor of Indiana and asked for time to reformulate, because they couldn't have one product that they sold in Indiana and then something different in Illinois or Michigan. And so in July of 2010, the ban on phosphorus in dishwashing detergent went into effect. And so whether you know it now or not, or you're seeing a few more spots, just keep in mind that it's good for the lakes.
One more comment on the phosphorus. In 2004, phosphorus is $25 a out of phosphorus. So it's time we stop using a lot of phosphorus from a practical
The
standpoint.
questioner makes a point that phosphorus is becoming much more expensive and also somewhat rare. We may run out of phosphorus in a few years, and so that may put a damper on the use of phosphorus as well. Are there other questions? Yes.
Rain gardens were just mentioned briefly, Judy mentioned them. Would that be a good idea for replacing retention ponds in places where retention areas are? And is there a way to educate not only homeowners associations, but cities and individuals on the value of a rain garden? Because a lot of the people I talk to don't even know what I'm talking about.
The question is, might rain gardens be a better alternative to some of the detention ponds that are in some of our subdivisions, and perhaps we could use more awareness of rain gardens in general?
Yeah, I just, one of the things that we did in Glenview is that we were applied for a grant and got a 319 grant, and we got a lot of volunteers, scout troops, and 2 summers ago we planted all of our detention basins with native plants. And they're doing fairly well, some a little better than others. We had neighborhood meetings because people were used to like a nice mowed grass that just happened to go down, but they function much better and they look much better. And I think for rain gardens, I agree with you 100%, and we need to have more of them like in the public square so that people can see them and understand them better.
I would say the thing about detention ponds is that the problem with the traditional way they've done detention ponds is you just have a hole with, you know, gravel or something outside. It's not really a functioning habitat. So they need to do detention ponds in different ways because those can be very productive habitats. In terms of rain gardens, like Judy said, having examples of rain gardens in town and showing people how they work would be the best way to do it. But I just lost it here. Here we go. But for example, parking lots are a great place for rain gardens. You can go to Friends of the Ryerson Woods and see a terrific example of a permeable surface with a rain garden where the water runs off what water does run off the parking lot goes into a rain garden in the center, and all the parking lots in town really should have rain gardens on the perimeter. The road should have rain gardens in the perimeter. These are all terrific ways to keep the water on the land and make productive landscape.
Is there another question? The questioner points out that the city of Milwaukee underwrote the cost of rain barrels for residents so that it only cost them about $10 a rain barrel, and that's something that can perhaps be done on the local level. We're way in the back.
Yeah. I don't know if you can hear me, but just a comment. My wife and I just came back from Australia, a town north of Brisbane, and I was surprised to see many homes had these, not the typical 55-gallon rain barrels which we use here in a few homes, not that many. But they had these very large tanks which were harvesting the rainwater, and they were then reusing it. They did look real pretty, but I guess the people had been educated to use it, something to think about.
The questioner points out that in north of Brisbane, some residents that he noted in a recent trip to Australia are using very large rain barrels, almost 55 gallons and greater, and they're reusing some of that rainwater on their property.
Yeah, a lot of those are like cisterns where they're, you know, probably many people years ago used to have them, and they kind of went out of style, but they're actually coming back in many places. Part of the problem, though, we have in Illinois is with our plumbing code, being able to reuse that water. Currently, I think there's some changes being proposed in the state legislature to change that code so you can use some of that water for other purposes, for instance, like flushing your toilet, right? You don't need fresh, clean water to flush your toilet. You can do that with what we call kind of gray water, rainwater. So there are some things that are kind of moving slowly, and those are kind of things that if you kind of keep track of them and support them with your state, or your representatives to say that you support these sorts of things, will go a long way.
Do we need to start to wrap up? Why don't I take maybe one more question? Is there one more question? We're good. I want to thank our speakers this evening for their informative presentations. I think we are all much the wiser after this evening, and thank you for all of the participants. And thank you to the League of Women Voters, AAUW, and Lake Forest Open Land.